Elias Warren thought he'd buried his past somewhere deep in the mountains of Wyoming. Until the night his husky, Luca, froze at the door, his eyes locked on the darkness like he was hearing a voice Elias couldn't. And when the dog finally led him through a blizzard to a forgotten cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, Elias realized this wasn't a rescue mission. It was a calling, one that would uncover a prisoner, a buried truth, and a woman he was never meant to find, yet destined to save. The winter that settled over the Snow Ridge Range that year felt older than the mountains themselves, a deep, bone-heavy cold that pressed down from the Wyoming sky and filled every ravine and pine-shadowed hollow with silence. Snow lay hip-deep in the meadows and lapped halfway up the dark trunks of the spruces, and when the wind came screaming off the high ridges, it drove needles of ice across the land, sanding away tracks, landmarks, and the last soft edges of autumn. For most folks, that kind of season was something you watched from behind double-glazed windows in town with the heater humming and coffee on the stove. But for Elias Warren, it was the only kind of world that made sense anymore. His cabin sat at the end of a barely there track, a squat shape of grayed logs and stone chimney tucked against a stand of firs that broke the worst of the wind. It had belonged to his uncle, a quiet man who'd loved the high country more than any human crowd. And now it belonged to Elias, a 32-year-old former Air Force pararescueman who'd learned the hard way that not every man you're sent to save comes home. In the picture over the small kitchen table, he and his team smiled in desert sun, sand on their boots, arms thrown over each other's shoulders. In the memory burned into him, one of those men lay still beneath a sky full of rotor wash and dust. And nothing Elias did could change that. That failure, that single moment of being half a step too slow, had followed him back from overseas, through the bars and base housing of Helena, and finally up here to Snow Ridge, where he'd traded the roar of engines for the low murmur of the stove and the sighing of pines. He looked like a man carved out of that mountain air, tall and rangy, with the kind of strength that didn't show until you saw him lift something heavy without thinking about it. Brown hair grown out just enough to curl at his collar, a faint scar along his jaw like a white thread someone had forgotten to cut. His eyes, a gray somewhere between storm cloud and creek ice, carried the kind of quiet that made people lower their voices around him. Most days he wore the same uniform, a battered brown leather jacket that had seen more miles than some pickups, flannel shirt in a red and black check, faded jeans, and insulated boots scuffed by countless trips to the woodpile. Out here, there was no need for dress blues or rank insignia. Out here, the mountain didn't care who you'd been. The only creature who ever challenged that silence was Luca. The husky had blown into Elias's life the winter before, a half-starved shadow huddled beside a snowdrift off an old logging road, eyes dulled but still watchful. Elias had seen enough suffering in human faces to recognize it in a dog's. He'd whistled once, soft, and the animal had dragged himself forward as if every step cost more than he could afford. Now, months later, Luca was a very different sight. He was 3 years old by the vet's best guess, big in the chest and shoulders with a thick pelt that ran from smoky gray to almost white along his sides and belly. His tail, a plume of dense fur, curled high when he trotted, and his ears stood alert at the slightest sound. There was intelligence in his amber eyes, a steady watchfulness Elias had come to rely on more than he liked to admit. Luca had the easy arrogance of a creature built for snow. He moved through drifts that slowed a man's stride to nothing, paws spreading his weight like snowshoes, lungs made for thin, cold air. In the cabin, he was calm and composed, content to stretch out by the stove and listen to the crackle of sap in the logs. But the slightest shift in the world outside, and he was on his feet, head lifted, nostrils flaring. Elias talked to him more than he talked to any human these days. The dog never answered, but his listening felt like something close. On the night it started, the wind had been building since noon, combing long white fingers across the ridgeline and sending sharp little avalanches spilling off the roofs of the forgotten ranch shacks in the valley. By dusk, the sky over Snow Ridge was a solid, bruise-colored mass, the kind that swallowed the last light in one gulp. Elias had stacked extra wood by the door and set a pot of coffee to simmer on the stove. There were fine crystals of ice in his beard when he came in, shaking the snow from his shoulders. Another storm, he thought. Another night of the world trying to erase itself. He fed Luca, checked the lock on the door more out of habit than concern, and settled into the old chair by the window with a dog-eared paperback he'd been pretending to read for 3 days. Outside, the storm arrived in full, snow shearing sideways past the glass, trees bowing and straightening like they were caught mid-prayer. Inside, the cabin was a bubble of warmth and orange light, the hum of the propane lamp and the soft tick of cooling metal relaxing the knots in his shoulders, inch by inch. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of pages turning and the rhythmic gusts against the walls. Then Luca sat up. It wasn't the slow, lazy rise of a dog deciding to shift positions. It was abrupt, as if a switch had been thrown. His ears pricked forward, body stiff, eyes locked not on Elias or the door, but on the far window that faced the deeper forest. A low rumble started in his chest, not loud but sustained, like distant thunder held just below the horizon. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, his voice rough from disuse. He set the book aside and followed Luca's gaze. There was nothing to see but swirling white and the faint suggestion of trees beyond. Still, the husky's hackles lifted along his spine, fur standing in a ridge from neck to tail. His lips didn't pull back, not yet, but the sound in his throat didn't stop. In his years downrange, Elias had learned to trust the instinct that tightened his gut at the first hint of wrongness. He felt it now, a prickle at the base of his skull. The rational part of his brain tried to file it away, maybe a drifting branch, a half-fallen tree creaking in the wind. But his body remembered too many nights when ignoring that feeling meant someone bled out on a floor. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered out again. Nothing. Just the storm. "Easy," he murmured, resting a hand on Luca's neck. The dog's muscles were taut under his fingers. Eventually, the growl faded, but the husky didn't relax. Long after Elias banked the stove and crawled into the narrow bunk built into the wall, Luca lay awake by the door, head on his paws, eyes open and fixed on the dark. The next day dawned bright and viciously cold. The sky scraped clean by the wind. Elias spent the morning digging a path to the shed and checking his traps along the tree line, breath ballooning in front of him, snow squeaking under his boots. Nothing seemed out of place. The tracks he crossed were the usual: rabbit, elk, the distant, delicate prints of a fox skirting the edge of the clearing. No intruders, human or otherwise. By the time he kicked the snow off his boots at the threshold and stepped back into the warmth, his cheeks burned and his fingers ached. Luca greeted him with a single wag of his tail, then went back to his spot by the window. That alone was wrong. The dog was usually eager for a game, a rough scratch behind the ears. Now he watched the forest the way a soldier watches a ridgeline. That night, the storm came back with a vengeance. Wind pounded the walls hard enough to make the lamp flicker, and fine powder sifted through the tiniest gaps in the logs. Elias forced himself to breathe slow, deep. He'd learned techniques for that, too, after the nightmares started, when the VA therapist with kind eyes and tired hands had talked about grounding and breath counts. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they didn't. Tonight, he barely made it through 2 pages before realizing he'd read the same line 3 times. With a muttered curse, he closed the book, leaned his head back, and simply listened to the storm. That was when he heard it. Not the wind, not the scrape of a branch, but a sharp, insistent scratching at the bottom of the door. Luca was already up. Every line of him pointed toward that sound. The scratching came again, followed by a long, hollow howl that raised the hair on Elias's arms. Not the wild, free cry of wolves he'd heard on clear nights, but something more desperate, frayed at the edges. "No way," he whispered, staring at the heavy wood. They were miles from the nearest ranch, further still from any town. Nobody in their right mind would be out here on foot in weather like this. Unless they weren't in their right mind. Unless they were running from something worse. A familiar tightness clamped down around his ribs, the echo of helicopter rotors and shouted coordinates rising like ghosts. Elias grabbed his rifle from its place on the wall and shrugged into his jacket. He didn't open the door all at once. Training wouldn't let him. Instead, he eased the bar up, cracked it just enough to see a wedge of darkness and blowing snow, and braced his shoulder against the frame. "If someone's out there," he called over the wind, "you picked a hell of a night to visit." The only answer was Luca's whine pressing against the back of his knees, and that same insistent scratching, closer now, like fingernails on old wood. He pulled the door wide. The storm hit him like a physical thing, a wall of cold air and swirling ice. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing, and then Luke darted forward, not out into the wild, but to his side, as if urging him to look lower. There, half buried in the drift that had piled against the threshold, lay a small shape, motionless. It was a bird, a grouse by the look of it, frozen stiff, eyes glazed. Elias stared, frowning. That wasn't right. That wasn't the sound he'd heard. Luca whined again and pushed past him, nose working furiously, but instead of bolting into the storm, the dog stopped, twisting his head toward the tree line. In his amber eyes burned a focus Elias had never seen before. The husky stepped out into the maelstrom, took 3 deliberate strides, then looked back over his shoulder. "Come on," the gesture said, as clear as speech. Elias glanced once at the safety of the cabin, the glow of the stove, the sheltering walls, and then out at the white void that stretched away in every direction. Common sense told him to shut the door, to ride out the storm and check for tracks in the morning. But he hadn't survived combat by trusting common sense over instinct. And Luca, who knew this snow and timber like he'd been born from it, was making his choice very clear. "You're gonna get us both killed," Elias muttered, grabbing his pack from its hook. He stuffed in a first aid kit, a coil of rope, a flashlight, and a thermos, his movements automatic. The rifle sling settled across his shoulder like something that had always belonged there. When he turned back, Luca was waiting at the edge of the light, snow already dusting his back, eyes never leaving Elias's face. "All right," Elias said, breath steaming. "You win. Show me." The world beyond the cabin swallowed them in seconds. Snow came sideways, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them, whiting out the horizon until there was nothing but a small circle of visibility around Elias's headlamp and the ghostly form of the dog ahead. Luca didn't lope joyfully like he did on clear days. He moved with intent, body low, choosing each step with care. He threaded them between black tree trunks and across small frozen creeks, sometimes pausing to test the ice before committing his full weight. Elias followed, boots punching deep, legs burning, lungs filling with razor-cold air that scraped all the words from his throat. Time stretched, lost its edges. It might have been an hour, it might have been 3. The only markers were the changing feel of the land underfoot, flat meadow becoming slope, slope becoming a shallow ravine, and the way the wind sometimes screamed full in their faces and sometimes dropped away to a dull roar. More than once, Elias found his thoughts sliding back to that last mission, to the feeling of following a point man into uncertainty, trusting that the path chosen was the right one because there was no room for doubt. Out here, Luca was that point man, a gray shadow pulling him deeper into the maze of Snow Ridge. When his legs began to shake with fatigue and the first threads of doubt wormed their way in, what if this is nothing? What if your head's just as broken as you feared? The dog's behavior changed. Luca stopped dead at the crest of a low rise, body gone rigid. A growl rolled out of him, different from the earlier one in the cabin, not fearful, but warning. Elias slogged the last few yards to his side and saw it. Below them, in a small clearing cupped by a ring of dark spruce, stood another cabin. This one was older than his, if that was possible, its logs silvered almost white by years of wind and snow. One window was boarded over, the roof sagging under the weight of the storm, but from the stone chimney, a thin column of smoke climbed into the writhing sky. Elias's first thought was simple, practical. Someone's alive in there. His second came colder. If someone's alive, why is there no sign of them outside? No tracks, no chopped wood piled by the door, no path through the drifts. The snow around the cabin lay unbroken except for a single trail leading to the front steps, half filled by fresh fall. Luca snarled, the sound exploding into the storm. He launched himself downhill, not at the building itself, but at the heavy wooden door where something dark and metallic gleamed in the beam of Elias's headlamp. By the time Elias reached him, the Husky was pawing frantically at a thick chain looped through the handle, nails clacking on iron. A padlock, old but solid, held it tight. Chain on the outside, Elias thought, his stomach turning to ice. Whoever was in there hadn't locked themselves in. Somebody else had. Fear might have frozen another man. For Elias, it kicked old training into overdrive. He slung the rifle behind his back, braced his shoulder, and used the butt like a hammer. The first strike rang off the padlock, metal on metal. The second jarred his arms to the elbow. The third hit just right, years of door-breaching drills paying off in a single, powerful blow. Rusted steel gave with a shriek and snapped, sending the lock spinning into the snow. Elias tore the chain free and threw his weight against the door. It stuck for a heartbeat, then burst inward, a wave of stale, frigid air washing over him. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the dull red eye of a banked fire in a stone hearth. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. There was a table, a chair, a few scattered cans on a shelf, and against the far wall, a narrow metal bed. On it lay a woman. She couldn't have been much younger than him, though at first glance it was hard to tell. Hunger and cold had smoothed real age into something ghost-like. Her hair, once probably a rich chestnut, hung in tangled ropes around her face. Her cheeks were hollowed, lips tinged blue. One wrist was cuffed to the bed frame, the skin beneath the metal raw and angry. For a second, Elias thought he was too late. Then her chest rose, shallow but definite. Luca reached her first. The big Husky vaulted onto the edge of the mattress with a soft chuff, curling his body along her side as gently as if she were made of glass. His tail thumped once. Her fingers twitched, searching, and found the fur at his ruff. "Luca," she whispered, voice a breath more than a sound. Her eyes cracked open, slate blue and fogged with exhaustion, but when they found the dog, there was the faintest flicker of relief. Then her gaze shifted past him, up to the stranger standing at the foot of her bed, snow melting off his jacket onto the warped floorboards. "They think I ran away," she rasped, every word an effort. "I didn't. He brought me here, locked me in. I didn't leave." The urge to ask a dozen questions burned on Elias's tongue, but there was no time for interrogations. He moved to the head of the bed, fingers working quickly at the cuff. It was an old model, cheap and mean, meant more to intimidate than truly secure. A twist and a pry with his multi-tool in it popped open. Pins and needles flushed angry color back into her hand as he rubbed it gently, trying to coax circulation back. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rowan," she breathed. "Rowan Hale." Her voice broke on the last word, as if saying her own name anchored her to a world she wasn't sure she still belonged to. Luca whined, licking the back of her hand. She turned to him again, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "I knew you'd find someone," she murmured to the dog, as if Elias weren't there. "I told you. If I couldn't get out, you had to run." While she clung to Luca, Elias's gaze swept the room, cataloging details. Near the bed, on the floor, where a less careful man might have missed it, a small notebook lay half hidden under a threadbare blanket. He picked it up, feeling the worn leather against his palm. The pages inside were filled with tight handwriting that started neat and grew shakier as it went. He skimmed, eyes catching on phrases. "My father's claim," "the Snow Ridge Survey," "Cousin Carter," "Debts," "Just sign it over, Rowan," and then darker lines. "He says no one will hear me up here. He brings just enough food. Luca is all I have left." The last entry was short, the ink blotched where a drop of water or a tear had fallen. "If I don't make it out, please let someone find Luca. He's my last hope." Elias closed the notebook slowly, the weight of it settling into his hand and his chest at the same time. Land, greed, family betrayal. None of it surprised him. He'd seen men do worse for less in countries where the mountains were made of sand instead of snow. But the fact that this woman had pinned her final hope not on a sheriff or a neighbor or some distant lawyer, but on the dog now pressed against her side, that twisted something inside him. He looked from the notebook to Rowan, from Rowan to Luca. The husky met his gaze, and in those amber eyes, Elias saw more than animal instinct. He saw mission completed. He saw a promise kept. Rowan's lashes fluttered. For the first time, she seemed to truly see him, really take in the stranger standing in her prison with snow in his hair and concern etched into the lines around his mouth. In the weak glow from the hearth, he saw her study him the way he'd studied her. Something gentle, tentative, flickered between them. Not romance, not yet, but the ghost of a future neither of them had thought to ask for. "You came," she whispered. Elias swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "No," he said quietly, glancing at Luca. "He did. I just followed." Outside, the storm roared on, beating against the log walls as if it wanted to claw them all back into the white. Elias knew they couldn't stay. The cabin was a tomb with the door torn open. They needed warmth, real medical care, the kind of help even a man with all his training couldn't provide alone. He slid his arms under Rowan, feeling how light she was, how easily he could have mistaken her for nothing at all under that thin blanket. She tensed, then relaxed, trusting her weight to him. Luca leapt from the bed and trotted to the door, tail high, as if officially assuming the role of lead scout again. "We're getting you out of here," Elias promised. As he stepped into the doorway, the night outside seemed to hold its breath. The wind dropped for a heartbeat, and in that fragile pocket of silence came a different sound, a distant, low thrum that started in his boots and rose up through his bones. Rotor blades, his mind supplied instantly, decades of aviation noise snapping into focus. A search and rescue bird? Out in weather like this? The idea felt like something out of a fever dream, but as he shifted Rowan in his arms and turned his face to the sky, he saw it. A faint halo of light cutting through the snow, growing brighter by the second. A helicopter, fighting the storm, angling in toward the clearing as if drawn by some invisible thread. Luca stood beside him, head lifted, ears pricked, watching the approaching glow. In that strange, suspended moment, snow whirling around them, a half-dead woman in his arms, a husky at his side, and a rescue chopper bearing down out of the murk, Elias felt the axis of his life tilt. He had come to Snow Ridge to disappear, to let the world forget him and his failures. Instead, somehow, the mountain had handed him a different role. Not the man who couldn't save a friend, but the man who'd followed a dog into the storm and found a stranger who, inexplicably, already mattered. As the helicopter's searchlight washed over them in a harsh white blaze, turning the snowflakes into a storm of sparks, Elias tightened his grip around Rowan and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with a clarity that rang as sharp as the cold in his lungs. Tonight was not an ending. It was the start of a new chapter, written in snow and smoke and the steady, unwavering loyalty of a husky who refused to give up. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the white silence stretching across the Jackson Hole Valley, as if the world were holding its breath for Rowan Hale to open her eyes again. Days had blurred into one another beneath the soft beeping of monitors and the low hum of the radiator that struggled against the Wyoming cold creeping through the hospital windows. Elias Warren had taken the chair beside her bed as though it were another post he'd been assigned, shoulders squared, jaw set, his brown hair still carrying a faint scent of pine smoke, as if he'd brought the mountain down into the sterile room. Luca often lay curled under his boots, lifting his head every time Rowan shifted or murmured in her sleep, the husky's amber eyes tracking her with an almost human protectiveness. When Rowan finally woke fully, truly woke, not halfway through pain and fever, she found the two of them watching her the way people look at the sunrise after too long in the dark. Rowan's face, though still pale, had regained some softness. The harsh shadows of captivity no longer clung so sharply to her cheekbones. In the dim hospital light, her slate-blue eyes looked clearer, the kind that once must have shone easily but had long forgotten how. Elias greeted her with a quiet "morning," though he had no idea what time it was. The mountain man in him simply felt the shift in her breathing, the way her fingers twitched against the blanket as if remembering warmth. Over the next few days, bits of her story emerged gently, like stones washed clean by a slow river. Rowan spoke of her father, a miner who had staked the original Snow Ridge claim decades earlier, a man with big dreams and worn hands, and of the land he left her. She spoke of Carter Hale, her cousin with a smile too sharp for family and debts heavier than the snow-shed roof in March. She had tried to help him once, believing blood still meant something, but greed had hollowed him out, leaving only calculation where kinship should have been. Elias listened in stillness. He had always gathered stories this way, letting people talk until the truth arranged itself into a pattern only he could see. Luca, too, seemed to understand. He would place his head on Rowan's knee when her voice wavered, staying perfectly still except for the slow sweep of his tail across the floor. When detectives arrived, a pair of worn, dust-coated men who looked more suited to ranch work than law enforcement, Elias led them back up the mountain with the unspoken precision of someone who'd spent years navigating terrain far less forgiving. One of the detectives, Sheriff Alan Cotter, was a tall man in his 50s with sunken eyes, gray stubble, and a quiet anger that simmered beneath his professionalism. He'd grown up in a mining town, had seen too many families fracture over claims and surveys and promises of riches that rarely came. As they sifted through the ruins of the abandoned cabin, Sheriff Cotter knelt near the hearth, brushing away soot until the glint of iron appeared. An old-fashioned key, blackened by heat but intact. It was Rowan's, he later confirmed, the key to her father's safe. They opened the safe under controlled conditions back in town, and inside were the original, legally binding deeds naming Rowan Hale the sole rightful owner of every acre of Snow Ridge land. Not Carter, not any Hale before him. Rowan. Carter Hale was arrested just outside a run-down bar in Moran, pale with shock, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But when confronted with the notebook Elias found and the chains on the cabin door, any veneer of innocence fell away, revealing the small, frightened man beneath the swagger. Yet even after justice had begun to turn, Rowan held something unspoken behind her eyes, something she hadn't dared reveal. That moment came late one evening in the hospital when the sun had dipped behind the Grand Tetons, leaving only faint lavender shadows brushing the snow. The nurses had dimmed the lights, and Luca slept with his muzzle resting on Rowan's slipper. Elias sat beside her, arms folded loosely, gaze drifting between the window and her steady breathing. Rowan reached for him suddenly, her fingers trembling slightly as they closed around his hand. "Elias," she whispered, her voice soft as snowmelt. "There's something I haven't told you." The world seemed to still. Elias leaned forward, the way he once had leaned toward wounded soldiers, whispering final truths. Rowan's eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. "I met your uncle," she said, "years ago, during a cave-in out near the eastern ridge. My father was trapped when a shaft collapsed. Everyone said help wouldn't come in time. But your uncle did." She paused, inhaling shakily. "He pulled my father out himself. They both nearly froze that night waiting for rescue. But your uncle never left his side. And after my father recovered, he'd said something I never forgot, that if anything ever happened, I could trust the Warrens, that your family didn't abandon people." The words washed over Elias like warm wind over snowfields, startling in their gentleness. His uncle, the man who had built the cabin Elias now called home, had been a quiet legend in more ways than he had ever admitted. And now the invisible threads binding their stories were drawn tight. Rowan and her father saved once by the elder Warren, and Rowan saved again by the younger, guided by the dog she loved. Days later, when Rowan was strong enough to leave, Elias drove her back up the mountain. The afternoon sky was a soft pewter, the kind that promised spring would come, but not yet. Luca rode in the truck's back seat, occasionally pressing his paw to Rowan's shoulder as if confirming she was truly there. When they reached the cabin, smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Elias had stoked the fire earlier, wanting warmth to greet her. Rowan stepped out, breath clouding in the crisp air, and she paused at the threshold as though listening for the heartbeat of the place. Instead of fear, there was a subtle easing in her posture, a familiarity, like she had finally returned to ground that had been calling her. In the days that followed, Rowan settled into the rhythms of the high country as if she had been born for them. She planted pots of wild columbine and fireweed near the porch, their color defying the lingering patches of snow. Elias repaired the sagging cabin eaves, pausing sometimes to watch Rowan work with quiet, unspoken admiration. Luca divided his days between shadowing Elias through the woods and curling beside Rowan as she read by the stove, as if trying to keep both halves of his world aligned. On the first evening the snows truly parted, the three of them stepped outside together, drawn by the strange, perfect stillness that followed the last melt. The mountains loomed blue and gold around them. Smoke curled from the cabin chimney. High above, a rescue helicopter passed across the glowing sky, its distant hum a reminder of the night everything had changed, a thread between past and present. Rowan stood framed in the doorway, hair catching the last streaks of light. She reached for Elias's hand with a gentle certainty. "Maybe Snow Ridge wasn't the place I nearly died," she murmured. "Maybe it's where I finally get to start living." The wind stirred then, soft as a blessing, brushing over them like something that understood far more than mere weather. When Rowan recovered fully, she reclaimed her land and made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not sell it, nor fence it, nor let it fall into greed's shadow again. Instead, she and Elias would turn it into a sanctuary, part natural preserve, part mountain rescue for abandoned dogs, a place where broken things could heal. Luca became their symbol, their guardian, the soul who had bridged what fate alone could not. And on a late summer evening, when the sky burned orange over the Snow Ridge pines, Elias took Rowan's hand on the porch of the cabin he once believed would be his exile. Now it was something else entirely. Home. Sometimes the mountains teach us what our busy lives make us forget, that miracles do not always come as lightning in the sky or thunder in the valley. Sometimes they walk toward us on four paws through a storm. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a stranger who becomes family. And sometimes God speaks in the quiet spaces between fear and courage, guiding us not with a shout, but with a whisper we almost miss. Elias and Rowan learned that healing does not come all at once. It comes in small, faithful steps. In choosing hope after heartbreak, in answering a call that makes no sense until we look back and see the path God traced beneath our feet. Their story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption. No wound is too deep, no winter too long. And love, especially the kind we do not see coming, can be the greatest miracle of all. If this story touched your heart today, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a little hope. Leave a comment below telling us what part spoke to you, or how God has nudged your life in unexpected ways. Your voice might be the encouragement someone else needs. And if you would like more stories of courage, grace, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps just as He guided theirs.